At Thanksgiving dinner, my sister stood up with a piece of paper and smiled coldly at me. The entire family had gathered: aunts, uncles, cousins, even my elderly grandmother. What should have been our annual tradition of gratitude became my worst nightmare. She announced, "We voted, and you're not family anymore." Everyone cheered like they'd been planning this moment, but they had no idea about the folder in my purse that would change everything. What happened next turned their celebration into absolute chaos. I'm Rebecca Martinez, and I used to believe family meant everything. Walking into Mom's house that Thursday afternoon, the smell of turkey and stuffing filled the air just like every Thanksgiving for the past 35 years. The dining room looked perfect. Mom's good china gleaming under the chandelier, golden autumn centerpieces arranged just so, and that familiar warmth that made this house feel like home. But something felt different this year, like walking into a movie set where everyone knew their lines except me. "Rebecca!" Aunt Linda called out, her voice just a little too bright. "So glad you could make it." She hugged me, but her arms felt stiff, mechanical. Uncle Tom nodded from his spot by the fireplace, offering that tight-lipped smile I'd seen him give to people he barely tolerated. Even my cousins, Lisa and Mark, who I'd grown up with like siblings, seemed to be watching me from the corner of their eyes. I set down the expensive wine I'd brought, a bottle that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries for a week. It was just another gesture in a long line of gestures, another way I'd tried to show my love for this family. For 20 years, ever since I'd graduated law school and built my practice, I'd been the one everyone called when they needed help. Car payments, medical bills, business loans, emergency repairs. I'd never said no, not once. The living room walls were covered with family photos spanning decades, but as I glanced around, something caught my attention. The recent photos, the ones from the last few family gatherings, seemed different. In fact, looking closer, I realized most of the pictures that included me had been moved or replaced. Where there used to be a photo of me and Sarah from last Christmas, now there was just one of Sarah alone. Where my college graduation picture used to hang, there was now a landscape painting. "Mom, did you redecorate?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, you know how it is," Mom replied without meeting my eyes. "Just freshening things up." But I knew every inch of this house. These weren't random changes, they were surgical removals. Every trace of me was being systematically erased, and somehow I was the last to notice. My sister Sarah breezed past me toward the kitchen, her pregnant belly pronounced at 6 months. She'd always been the golden child, married young, gave Mom grandchildren, stayed close to home. Everything I'd apparently failed to do by focusing on my career. "Sarah, you're glowing," I said, reaching out to touch her arm. She pulled away slightly, just enough to make it clear the gesture wasn't welcome. "Thanks," she replied coolly. "Michael's in the kitchen helping with the turkey if you want to say hi." Michael had been my brother-in-law for 8 years, and I'd helped pay for their wedding, their house down payment, even their fertility treatments. But when he saw me in the kitchen, his greeting was distant, distracted. He couldn't quite look me in the eye. As more family members arrived, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume with forced enthusiasm about topics I wasn't part of. People who used to seek out my company now seemed to be avoiding me. My grandmother, who'd always been my strongest supporter, barely acknowledged my presence beyond a brief nod. The whispered conversations were the worst part. I caught fragments. "Finally time. She needs to hear this. It's for the best." But whenever I got close enough to listen, the conversations would shift to safe topics like the weather or football scores. It was like being the subject of a conspiracy I wasn't invited to understand. I found myself standing alone in the hallway, studying a family portrait from 5 years ago. In it, we all looked happy, genuine, connected. I was in the center, arms around Sarah and Mom, everyone smiling. Now, standing in that same hallway, I felt like a stranger in my own family's home. The house I'd grown up in, the house I'd secretly been paying the mortgage on for the past 3 years since Dad's death, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. When Mom called everyone to dinner, I took my usual seat at the table, but even that felt wrong. The conversations flowed around me like I was invisible. Sarah sat across from me, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her eyes holding a hardness I'd never seen before. The same eyes that used to light up when I'd surprise her with concert tickets or help her through her divorce from her first husband. The meal proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that made the food taste like cardboard in my mouth. Every laugh felt forced, every compliment felt hollow. I kept waiting for someone to explain what was happening, why everyone was acting like they were performing in a play I hadn't been given the script for. But no one offered any answers, and every attempt I made to engage was met with polite but distant responses. That's when Sarah stood up, reaching into her purse for a folded piece of paper. Her movements were deliberate, practiced, like she'd rehearsed this moment. The entire table fell silent, all eyes turning toward her with an expectation that made my stomach drop. This wasn't spontaneous, this was planned, orchestrated, and I was apparently the only person who didn't know what was coming. Before we say what we're thankful for this year, Sarah began, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before, I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room. The transformation that began in that moment would haunt me for months afterward. Sarah's face changed from my little sister's familiar features into something cold and calculating. She unfolded the paper with theatrical precision, making sure everyone could see it was covered in signatures. Names I recognized, every person sitting at this table, plus relatives who weren't even here. Rebecca, she continued, looking directly at me for the first time all day. We've all been talking, and we've come to a decision. We took a family vote. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. My hands grew cold, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. A family vote? About what? About me? The concept was so alien, so cruel, that I couldn't immediately process what she was suggesting. This family has been walking on eggshells around you for years. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more confident. You think your money makes you better than us. You think you can buy our love and respect. But we're tired of pretending that your guilt payments mean anything. Guilt payments. The words hit like a physical blow. Every time I'd helped with a car repair, every medical bill I'd covered, every emergency loan I'd provided without question, she was calling them guilt payments, as if my love, my desire to help the people who meant everything to me, was some kind of manipulation tactic. You've never really been one of us, Uncle Tom chimed in, his voice gaining momentum like he'd been waiting years to say this. Always acting like you're doing us favors, like we should be grateful for your charity. You missed Jimmy's graduation for a work conference, Cousin Lisa added. You missed Mom's birthday last year because you were in court. You're never really here, Rebecca. You're just visiting your investments. The accusations came faster now, like a dam had burst. Years of perceived slights, misunderstandings, and resentments poured out in a torrent that left me speechless. Every absence due to work was reframed as arrogance. Every financial gesture was reinterpreted as condescension. Every choice I'd made to build a career, to create the financial stability that had benefited all of them, was being used as evidence of my fundamental unworthiness. So we voted, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Unanimously, we don't want you in this family anymore. The words hit me like ice water. Don't want you in this family anymore. As if family was something you could simply vote someone out of, like a club membership or a business partnership. As if 35 years of shared history, of love, of connection, could be erased by signatures on a piece of paper. The cheering started slowly, a clap from Uncle Tom, then a finally from Cousin Mark. But it built into something more vicious, more celebratory. They were applauding my exile like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Even my grandmother, the woman who had taught me to bake cookies and told me bedtime stories, was nodding in approval. You can pack your things and don't come back, Sarah continued, clearly enjoying her moment of power. We're changing the locks tomorrow. This isn't your home anymore. I sat in stunned silence, watching the faces of people I'd loved my entire life transform into something unrecognizable. These weren't the people who'd celebrated my law school graduation, who'd called me when they needed help, who'd told me I was the strong one, the successful one, the one they could count on. These were strangers wearing familiar faces, united in their rejection of everything I thought I meant to them. But even in my shock, even as my world crumbled around me, a small part of my mind remained clear and calculating. The lawyer in me, the part that had learned to think strategically even in crisis, began to process what was really happening here. And what was happening was that they had no idea who they were actually dealing with. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder I'd brought with me. Not because I'd expected this, but because I'd been preparing for something like this for longer than they could possibly imagine. As I placed it gently on the table, my voice came out surprisingly steady. "Then I guess you won't need this." Sarah's eyes lit up with curiosity and triumph. She probably thought it was some kind of final gift, one last desperate attempt to buy my way back into their good graces. She reached for the folder eagerly, her fingers already working at the clasp before she'd even opened it fully. The moment she saw the first document, her face went white, then red. Then something beyond any color I'd ever seen in human skin. Her hands started shaking so violently that the papers scattered across the table, and that's when she started screaming. Not yelling, not shouting. Screaming like she'd seen something that challenged her fundamental understanding of reality, because in a way, she had. The folder contained copies of every financial document that had kept this family afloat for the past decade. The mortgage papers showing that I'd bought the house from the bank when Mom and Dad were facing foreclosure 5 years ago. The business licenses for Uncle Tom's construction company and Cousin Mark's landscaping business, both of which were registered in my name because their credit couldn't qualify. The loan agreements for Sarah's house, her car, even the fertility treatments that had made her current pregnancy possible. But most importantly, it contained the credit reports showing that virtually everyone in that room was listed as an authorized user on my credit cards. For years, I'd been quietly paying their bills, covering their emergencies, maintaining their standard of living, all while they convinced themselves they were independent, self-sufficient people who just occasionally needed help from their successful relative. The screaming continued as more documents spilled across the table. Power of attorney forms I'd had them sign during various crises. Insurance policies where I was listed as the beneficiary because I'd been paying the premiums. Investment accounts I'd opened in trust for their children's college educations. A paper trail that painted a very different picture than the one they'd just spent the evening constructing. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. Everyone was staring at the documents now, their faces running through the same sequence of emotions I'd just watched Sarah experience. Confusion, recognition, horror, understanding. 30 days, I said quietly, my voice carrying in the stillness. That's how long you have to find somewhere else to live. All of you. Because the truth was, I didn't just own Mom's house. I owned Uncle Tom's house too. The one I'd bought when he'd defaulted on his mortgage 3 years ago. I owned the building where Cousin Lisa ran her hair salon, the one I'd purchased as an investment property and rented to her at a fraction of market rate. I owned more of their lives than they'd ever owned of mine. The family that had just voted to exile me was about to discover that they'd been living in my world all along. And now that they'd made their choice, they were about to find out what life looked like without the safety net they'd never even realized was there. Sarah was still screaming, but now it was mixed with words. "This can't be legal. You can't do this. You can't just throw us out." But I could, and I would, because sometimes the only way to show people what they're really rejecting is to let them experience life without it. The silence that followed Sarah's screaming was deafening. I watched as the reality of their situation sank in, each face around the table cycling through the same devastating realization. They had just voted to exile the person who had been quietly holding their entire world together. For 20 years, I had been the invisible foundation beneath their feet, and they had never even bothered to look down. Uncle Tom picked up one of the scattered documents with trembling hands, the deed to his house with my name clearly printed as the owner. "Rebecca, this has to be some kind of mistake. I've been making payments on this house for 15 years. "You've been making payments to me, Tom," I replied calmly. "When you defaulted in 2021, I bought it from the bank to save your credit. You've been paying rent, not a mortgage. Check your bank statements. The payments go to Martinez Property Holdings, my investment company." His face crumpled like a paper bag. Aunt Linda grabbed his arm for support, but she was staring at another document that showed the same thing about her condo. The little retirement nest egg she thought she owned was actually a property I'd purchased when she'd faced bankruptcy after her divorce. Cousin Mark's landscaping business license caught his eye next. "What the hell is this? My business is in your name?" "Your credit score was 480 when you wanted to start the business, Mark. No bank would give you a license bond. I put the business in my name, got the permits, the insurance, everything. You've been operating under my business umbrella for 6 years. The documents told a story none of them had wanted to see. For 2 decades, every crisis had been quietly resolved by my checkbook. Every emergency had been cushioned by my credit. Every dream they'd pursued had been underwritten by my success. They had built their lives on a foundation of my financial support while convincing themselves they were independent. Sarah was hyperventilating now, clutching her pregnant belly. "You can't do this to us. I'm having a baby. We have nowhere to go." "You should have thought about that before you voted me out of the family," I said, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't experienced around them: peace. "I've spent 20 years being your safety net, your backup plan, your silent partner, and your gratitude was to decide I wasn't worthy of being your family." Mom finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Rebecca, honey, we can talk about this. We were just upset about—" "About what, Mom?" "About the mortgage payments I've been making on this house for 3 years. About the property taxes I pay. About the insurance premiums. This house would have been foreclosed on after Dad died if I hadn't stepped in. But apparently, keeping you housed and secure made me a bad family member." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through a folder I'd labeled Family Conversations. The lawyer in me had learned long ago to document everything, especially when money was involved. I hit play on the first recording. Sarah's voice filled the room. "She thinks she's so much better than us with her fancy law degree and her downtown office, always throwing her money around like it means something." Then Lisa's voice. "I'm so tired of feeling like we owe her something every time she helps out, like we're her charity cases." And Mark. "She probably writes us off on her taxes as charity work. Rich bitch thinks she owns us." The recordings went on for several minutes, months of conversations I'd inadvertently captured when they'd called while my phone was recording for work. Conversations that revealed what they really thought of my help, my love, my sacrifices. They had spent years resenting the very support that had made their comfortable lives possible. "You want to know why I have these recordings?" I asked as the playback ended. "Because I've been preparing for this day for 2 years. Ever since I realized that every family gathering felt like a performance, every conversation felt scripted. I hired a family therapist to help me understand what was happening, and she helped me see that I was in an emotionally abusive relationship with all of you." The therapist had been Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in family dynamics and financial abuse. During our sessions, she'd helped me recognize the patterns I'd been blind to for years. The way they'd gaslight me about my work commitments. The way they'd make me feel guilty for having success, while simultaneously depending on that success. The way they'd positioned themselves as the victims of my generosity while never acknowledging the sacrifices I'd made. Financial abuse, I continued, watching their faces. "That's what Dr. Williams called it. You've been exploiting my love for you, manipulating my guilt about being successful, and using my money while treating me like an outsider. And when I started setting boundaries, when I couldn't make every family event because of work, when I asked you to pay me back for some of the larger loans, you decided the solution was to cut me out entirely." The credit card statements came next. Sarah's face went completely pale as she saw her name listed as an authorized user on 6 different cards with balances totaling over $40,000, grocery bills, clothing purchases, restaurant charges, even a vacation to Disney World she'd claimed they'd saved up for. The IRS considers authorized users to be jointly responsible for debt, I said matter-of-factly. When I cancel these cards tomorrow morning, those balances become immediately due. You'll need to arrange payment plans directly with the credit card companies. Uncle Tom was frantically shuffling through papers now, looking for some document that would prove I was wrong, that his financial stability was real. But every paper told the same story. A man whose income barely covered his basic expenses, whose lifestyle was subsidized by his successful niece's silent support. The construction jobs you've been getting, Tom? Half of them came through my business contacts. The commercial accounts that keep your company profitable? I've been steering that work your way for years through my client network. He looked like he was going to be sick. His construction business, which he'd built up as proof of his independence and capability, was largely dependent on contracts I'd arranged. Without those connections, he'd be competing for small residential jobs against companies with better equipment and lower overhead. The business licenses were perhaps the cruelest revelation. Mark's landscaping company, Lisa's hair salon, even Sarah's part-time consulting business, all were registered as subsidiaries of my investment company for tax and liability purposes. They thought they were entrepreneurs, but they were essentially employees of enterprises I owned and managed. So, when you voted to remove me from the family, I said, my voice growing stronger, you were voting to remove the person who has been quietly managing your entire economic ecosystem. Congratulations, you're about to find out what independence actually feels like. The next part was the hardest for me to watch, but it was necessary. One by one, I watched the people I'd loved realize that their lives were built on foundations they'd never seen. Sarah's house wasn't really hers. The down payment had been my money, and I held a private mortgage that had never been recorded because I'd wanted to avoid the paperwork and complications. When she'd refinanced last year, she'd thought she was getting a better interest rate, but she'd actually been getting a loan that I'd guaranteed with my assets. The college funds I'd established for their children became another point of devastating clarity. Lisa's daughter Emma was supposed to start at State University next fall, with what Lisa thought was a scholarship that covered full tuition. It wasn't a scholarship. It was a trust fund I'd established and funded. Mark's twin boys were enrolled in an expensive private school that he thought his business success could afford, but the tuition payments came directly from an education account I managed. Those college funds, the kids' school tuition, the health insurance supplements I've been paying because your jobs don't offer good coverage, all of that ends now. Your vote to exclude me from the family was also a vote to exclude my financial support from your lives. The room erupted into chaos then. Sarah started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that made her whole body shake. Lisa was frantically trying to call her bank, as if she could somehow undo the reality of what she was seeing. Mark was pacing behind his chair, running his hands through his hair and muttering numbers under his breath, trying to calculate how much money they'd need to replace what I'd been providing. But the most devastating moment came when I pulled out the final document, the life insurance policies. After Dad died, I'd realized that none of them had adequate life insurance to protect their families, so I'd quietly taken out policies on all of them, with myself as the beneficiary, and I'd been paying the premiums. My reasoning had been simple. If something happened to any of them, I wanted to be able to take care of their children, pay off their debts, handle the funeral expenses without burdening the surviving family members. Even your deaths were my responsibility, I said, holding up the insurance papers. Because I knew that if something happened to any of you, I'd be the one paying for the funerals, supporting the widows, raising the orphans. I've been preparing to take care of you even beyond the grave. Mom broke down then, really broke down, in a way I hadn't seen since Dad's funeral. Rebecca, we didn't know. We had no idea it was this extensive. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Every time I tried to talk about money, about budgets, about planning for the future, you'd change the subject. You wanted the benefits of my support without the responsibility of acknowledging it. The transformation in the room was complete now. The people who had been celebrating my exile an hour ago were now faced with the reality of what that exile actually meant. It wasn't just losing a family member, it was losing their entire way of life. The safety net they'd never seen was suddenly brutally visible in its absence. Sarah was the first to try to negotiate. "Rebecca, please, we made a mistake. We were angry about things that don't matter. We can call this off. We can tear up that vote." "No," I said simply. "You can't. Because this wasn't a mistake made in anger. This was a planned, coordinated effort that required months of discussion and preparation. You researched, you debated, you took a formal vote, you got signatures. This was premeditated rejection." I stood up and began gathering the documents. "The eviction notices will be served by the sheriff's department within 48 hours. The credit cards will be canceled tomorrow morning. The business licenses will be transferred to new entities that you can apply for independently. The children's school accounts will be closed at the end of this semester." "But where will we go?" Lisa asked, her voice breaking. "Our credit is destroyed. We can't get approved for apartments, let alone mortgages." "I'm sure you'll figure it out. After all, you've made it very clear that you don't need me." The cruelest part, the part that would haunt them long after the immediate financial crisis passed, was the realization that they had destroyed something irreplaceable. Not just their financial security, but their relationship with someone who had loved them unconditionally for decades. I had never asked for gratitude, never demanded recognition, never held my support over their heads as leverage. I had simply loved them and expressed that love through action. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out a final folder. "Dr. Williams recommended that I write letters to each of you, explaining how your treatment affected me over the years. Originally, I was going to give these to you as part of an intervention, hoping we could work through our problems as a family." I placed the sealed envelopes on the table, each one labeled with a family member's name. "Now they're goodbye letters. Read them when you want to understand what you've lost." As I walked toward the door, Uncle Tom made one last desperate attempt. "Rebecca, wait. We can pay you back. We can make this right." I turned back to face them one final time. "Pay me back with what money, Tom? Your construction business is about to lose its biggest contracts. Your house payment is about to triple when you have to get a real mortgage. Your truck payment, your equipment loans, your business insurance, all of that was connected to my financial umbrella." The math was simple and brutal. Without my support, their expenses would increase dramatically while their income decreased. They would face a financial catastrophe that would take years to recover from, if they ever could. But as I looked at their faces, shocked, desperate, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd lost, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but relief. For the first time in 20 years, I was free from the exhausting cycle of being taken for granted by people who claimed to love me. "Goodbye," I said, and walked out into the crisp November evening. Behind me, I could hear the sound of my former family beginning to tear apart as the reality of their situation set in. Tomorrow, they would start discovering just how much of their world had been dependent on the person they'd voted out of their lives. But tonight, for the first time in decades, I was going home to a life that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new downtown apartment, reading a newspaper article about a local family who had lost their homes in what the reporter described as a cascade of financial difficulties following a family dispute. The article didn't mention names, but I recognized the story. Sarah had given an interview, painting herself as the victim of a vindictive relative who had destroyed an entire family over a misunderstanding. The article made me sound like a monster, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. But then I remembered the recordings, the years of being taken for granted, the carefully planned vote to exile me from my own family. I remembered the cheering when they thought they were getting rid of their burden. My phone rang. It was Dr. Williams checking in as part of our ongoing therapy work. "How are you feeling about the article?" she asked. "Sad," I admitted. "Not guilty, not angry, just sad that it came to this." "That's healthy," she said. "You're mourning the family you thought you had. not regretting the decision to protect yourself from the family you actually had. She was right. The family I'd loved and supported for 20 years had been largely a fiction I'd created in my mind. The real family, the one that had voted me out, had been using me all along. My choice had been between continuing to enable their abuse or choosing my own well-being. I'd chosen myself, and for the first time in my adult life, I was building relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. My chosen family consisted of friends who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide, colleagues who valued my expertise, a romantic partner who brought as much to the relationship as I did. The children were the hardest part. Emma, Lisa's daughter, had reached out through social media, not understanding why her college money had disappeared. I'd sent her information about scholarships and student aid, along with a gentle explanation that sometimes adults make choices that affect the people they're supposed to protect. Mark's twins had been withdrawn from their private school and enrolled in public school, an adjustment that was difficult but not devastating. Sarah's baby had been born healthy, and despite everything, I'd anonymously sent a gift to the hospital. Not money, just a beautiful handmade blanket. I couldn't stop loving them completely, but I could love them from a distance that protected my own emotional well-being. The ripple effects of their decision had been exactly as devastating as I'd predicted. Uncle Tom's construction business had folded within 3 months. Without the commercial contracts I'd arranged and the financial backing I'd provided, he couldn't compete. He and Aunt Linda had filed for bankruptcy and moved into a small apartment across town. Mark's landscaping business survived, but barely. He'd had to sell most of his equipment and take on partners to handle the debt load. The financial stress had put a strain on his marriage, and he was now working essentially as an employee in a business that used to have his name on it. Lisa had managed to keep her hair salon open by taking on a business partner who owned 60% of the venture. Her dream of owning her own business had become a reality of working for someone else while maintaining the liability. Sarah and Michael had lost their house and moved in with his parents. The stress of the financial crisis, combined with the demands of a new baby, had pushed their marriage to the breaking point. Michael had taken a second job to try to make up for the income they'd lost, which meant Sarah was essentially raising the baby alone. But perhaps the most significant change was that they had all been forced to confront reality in a way they never had before. Without my safety net, they'd had to make difficult decisions about their lifestyles, their priorities, their spending habits. Some of those changes were healthy, even necessary. They were learning to live within their actual means rather than the artificial prosperity my support had created. I'd received exactly 3 attempts at reconciliation. Uncle Tom had called once, drunk and rambling, alternating between apologies and accusations. Lisa had sent a long email explaining that she'd finally understood what I'd done for them and begging for another chance. And Sarah had shown up at my office, baby in tow, crying and asking if we could start over. To each of them, I'd given the same response. I forgave them, but I wouldn't be resuming our previous relationship. Forgiveness, I'd learned in therapy, didn't require me to subject myself to more of the same treatment. I could wish them well without putting myself back in harm's way. The transformation in my own life had been remarkable. Without the constant drain of supporting an extended family who neither appreciated nor acknowledged my sacrifices, I had more time, more energy, and more emotional bandwidth for the things that actually mattered to me. I'd started dating someone wonderful, a fellow lawyer who understood the demands of our profession and who brought his own success and stability to the relationship. I'd also begun volunteering with an organization that helped people navigate family financial abuse. My story, it turned out, was far from unique. There were thousands of people who found themselves in similar situations. Successful individuals whose families treated them like ATMs while simultaneously resenting their success. The work was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Helping others recognize and escape these toxic dynamics gave meaning to my own painful experience. I was turning my family's betrayal into something useful, something that could help other people protect themselves from similar harm. On quiet evenings like this one, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if they'd never held that vote, if they'd continued the charade indefinitely. Would I have eventually found the strength to set boundaries on my own? Would I have recognized the abuse without Dr. Williams' help? Or would I have continued enabling them until I had nothing left to give? The vote, as devastating as it had been in the moment, had actually been a gift. It had forced me to see our relationship clearly, without the rose-colored glasses of love and loyalty that had obscured the truth for so long. They had shown me exactly what I meant to them, and ironically, that revelation had set me free. My chosen family now consisted of people who celebrated my successes rather than resenting them, who offered support rather than only requesting it, who valued my presence rather than just my presence. I had learned the difference between being loved and being used, and that knowledge had transformed every relationship in my life. The family that had voted to exile me had given me the greatest gift they could have: the truth about who they really were, and the motivation to build a life worthy of who I really was. Their rejection had become my liberation, and for that, I would always be grateful. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt something I'd never experienced during all those years of family obligations: complete peace with my choices. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new relationships, new ways to use my success to build rather than enable. And for the first time in my adult life, I was excited to see what that looked like. The family that had voted me out had taught me the most valuable lesson of all: that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away,